with funding from Veterans in Affairs Canada. Today we are joined by Dr. Tim Cook. For those of you who don't know, but anyone who's dabbled in Canadian military history at all will have heard of Dr. Cook. He is the acting director of research at the Canadian War Museum. He's curated numerous temporary, traveling, and digital exhibitions. He is the author of 13 books, with the newest, The Fight for History, 75 Years of Forgetting, Remembering, and Remaking Canada's Second World War, which was published earlier this month. He is a member of the Royal Society of Canada and the Order of Canada. And just before we get underway, there's a couple of housekeeping items. For those of you who are joining us virtually and would like the French option, there's a globe at the bottom of your screen. And if you click that, you can go into the French room. And there you will receive a simultaneous French translation of the event today. Donc pour ceux et celles qui veulent avoir la présentation en français, nous avons une autre salle dans Zoom. Donc si vous cliquez sur le monde, vous pouvez aller et avoir la traduction en français. And Dr. Cook, thank you very much for being with us today.
Nice to be with you, and hello to everyone out there. I wish we could all be in the same room, but we know circumstances demand we can't do that. But I look forward to our conversation today, Prasanna and I think there'll be a period at the end where you will pose questions, and I'll do my best to answer those. So I'm looking forward to that as well, hearing from you, your observations, your questions, and your commentary.
Mm-hmm. Just as we continue, I'll make a quick note. We're looking at some images from the They Fought in Color project by the Vimy Foundation. It's a book available with numerous colorized images from the First World War. Dr. Cook and many other well-known Canadian authors were part of the project, and they offered commentary on some of the images. We might come back to that a little bit later during the session. And of course, let's get underway. And I think the first question for you, that I have for you, Dr. Cook, is why in general do societies commemorate events like the First World War?
Well, I think Canada's Great War was a traumatic event in our history. 50 years after Confederation, it was the most significant event up to that point. We had 620,000 Canadians who served from a country of 8 million. We fought on the Western Front. The Canadian Corps, commanded by a Canadian from June of 1917, Sir Arthur Currie, was really a national symbol. This was Canada stepping out onto the world stage, contributing, standing shoulder to shoulder with our allies, fighting at places like Second Deep, the Somme, Vimy, Hill 70, Passchendaele, and the 100 Days campaign. But we paid a terrible price, 66,000 Canadians killed. And I think the trauma of those deaths, along with how the war brought us together like never before, but also divided us. And if we think of the conscription crisis as one of the most divisive events in our shared history, this is a war that changed us. And coming out of the war, Canadians, after victory on November 11th, 1918, struggled, I think, to make meaning of the war. And one of the ways they did that was to build memorials to the fallen. And we know that they are across this country. There are thousands of them in every city, every town, every village. I imagine wherever you are, those who are the 100 people or so who are here with us today, there is a memorial to the Great War in your, where you grew up and where you are now. So just an astonishing change to our memorial landscape. If we think also of provincial memorials, if we think of national memorials and overseas memorial like Beaumont Hamel or Vimy. And so one way to make meaning of the war, I think, was to create these stone memorials, but also symbolic acts of remembrance. Think of Armistice Day, known as Remembrance Day in 1931. Think of the power of the poppy. Think of John McCrae's poem, which initially is a martial poem, and then in the 20s becomes a poem about the need to remember. And so we see coming out of the Great War, this creative impulse, and I think this need to understand the service and the sacrifice and the many changes that occurred to our country as a result of the Great War.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive answer. And I think there's a few interesting points there that I kind of want to draw back. For a little bit of context, I did the Vimy Prize run by the Vimy Foundation 10 years ago now, in 2010, and like I've had the the privilege to be able to travel across the country, and I guess one of my first questions is or observations maybe, and you can perhaps expand on this, is that like when you look at the different memorials across this country, whether it be in Sussex, New Brunswick, or Fredericton, where I'm located today, or Vancouver, they all have a very similar theme, but then they also have very, varied, styles and architectural features. And then we have buildings that are used as memorials, such as Memorial Hall at the University of New Brunswick. I know the University of Toronto has a tower that's dedicated. I know that those patterns also exist in the United Kingdom. So I guess in terms of these memorials, how did they come about? Was it a concentrated effort that was centralized and kind of funding given and people went about it, or was it really grassroots and each of these communities took it upon themselves to do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And for the most part, it was grassroots. It was in the communities. And after the war, these community leaders and veterans and grieving parents and large segments of the society came together to raise money to build memorials. And I think, if you've traveled this country, as I was mentioning before, you will find a memorial, and many of them often in every community. And they're not just the stone memorials, although they come in every shape and size, some with sculptured figures on top, soldiers, often they are obelisks. They are usually and almost always are cenotaphs, insofar as that there is no body there. We left our Canadian soldiers overseas for the most part in the Commonwealth War Graves cemeteries, as they're known today. And those are very powerful places to visit. And I think that they continue to draw back Canadians. But I think because we left our soldiers overseas, our fallen soldiers, that there was this need to create something in our communities. And one of the things I've argued in some of my books is, even though we often think of the Great War as this great national event, and even the Canadian Corps as a formation 100,000 strong, it, of course, was formed by individual Canadians, ordinary men pulled from across this country, English Canadians, French Canadians, New Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, Canadians from every region, every class, almost every religion. And so that is why after the war, it was those same communities where the survivors returned to, the veterans, those healthy in body, and those who were suffering from physical wounds, and I think we have a greater sense now of the mental wounds as well, coming together to create a place to remember, to commemorate, and to bear witness.
Yeah, I think and that's a fair point, and I think I've noticed that in terms of how, it's really not that you only see, like, there's the National War Memorial in Ottawa, of course, but it's, it's a very powerful place to visit. But I think I've been to Remembrance Day ceremonies across this country as well, and it doesn't really matter how big the community is, you get that same sense of common understanding and common loss, I guess, that we're trying to commemorate.
Yeah. No, I just want to add something there, Prasanna. Of course, you're exactly right. There are national monuments. Think of the Peace Tower in Ottawa, with Parliament burning down in 1916, and then the tower erected and unveiled in 1927. We have our National Memorial in downtown Ottawa, the competition in 1925. Vernon March, who was the architect, and his siblings, after he died, I believe in 1930, carried on with that memorial unveiled in May of 1939. And then most importantly, if we're here with the Vimy Foundation, to talk about Beaumont Hamel overseas, and of course the Vimy Memorial unveiled in 1936, an astonishing event where more than 6,000 Canadians who called themselves pilgrims in a very sacred way, most of them veterans with their loved ones, crossed the Atlantic in one of the largest movements of civilians in our history, to converge on that ridge with Walter Allward's powerful memorial. And as some of you know, I wrote a book on this, Vimy, the Battle and the Legend. And I was there in 2017 when 25,000 Canadians returned to the ridge, an absolutely astonishing and epic event to be a part of. And I was very lucky to be a historical commentator with CBC at the time. And Prasanna, I know you've been there. One feels the weight of history. It's a place where I have always said, I really hope every Canadian has a chance to go to. It's a place of pride. It's a place of sorrow. One feels the ghosts of Vimy there. And I think those who go leave changed.
Oh, for sure. It's a very, very striking monument. And during our program, we actually, unlike, if you drive up to the monument, you follow the parking lot, you follow the roads, you start on the ridge. And so you get a sense, it very much overlooks a lot of, it's a very large landscape that you're overlooking. But we, as part of the program, we actually walked from further down. And then I remember we just walked up the ridge itself. And it's a very deceiving hill. Like you don't get the sense of scale in the same way that you do unless you try to walk that up. And like it looks like a normal, small gradient. But by the time you're done, it's exhausting. And to think that during the Battle of Vimy Ridge, this is what they secured.
I've led battlefield tours there, Prasanna, and we do that. We walk up, and it doesn't feel like much at first. That gradual climb, of course, you're moving up the divisional boundary between the 3rd and the 4th Division, moving up towards Hill 145, where an elite German, the Prussians were dug in there on the 9th of April of 1917, when the Canadian soldiers, 4 divisions strong, stormed up the ridge. But when you think about it, 3,600 dead in the 4-day battle, most of them on that first day. Every step you take, 100 years later, every step you take, if you reflect back to what the Canadians were doing on that cold day on the 9th of April, there would have been a body there. You would have been stepping over the bodies of your comrades. And it is incredibly powerful to make that trip, to walk the ridge, to study the terrain, to look out over the Douay Plain, to see the sculptured figures from Walter Allward on the memorial, the twin spires, the 11,285 names of fallen Canadians with no known graves in France, and then to return, I think, to the museum there, which the Vimy Foundation played a key role in having built. It is a place that one never forgets.
For sure. And I mean, I had the fortune of doing it during good weather, but you're not going to have a very clear day when you're fighting during a battle. And I mean, I guess it's this like, all of these aspects of how challenging it was for all these Canadians and the 3,600 who died, which is a very significant number even today. But we're talking about when Canada's population was maybe, less than a third of what it is today. And so it's very, very striking for sure. And I guess you mentioned that all the graves overseas are in the Commonwealth format and the Commonwealth grave format. And at the same time, we talk about Vimy being sort of the birthplace of Canada as its own nation. And I know it's not just Canada that has Commonwealth graves, and I've also had the privilege of seeing Commonwealth graves across the world. So I've seen one cemetery in India, for example, that looks pretty much the same as the one you'd see in France, or the one, and I know the Legion has adopted a similar, at least locally in Fredericton, the gravestones that they use are similar in format. Was there a lot of deliberation in terms of how these gravestones were done, or was it just that it was such a large global effort that they chose to follow the same pattern as everyone else?
No, there was a deliberate series of policies and discussions of which Canada and Australia and New Zealand were all involved in dealing with the British and the Imperials to create uniform cemeteries. Many of the watchers here will have visited them, the cross of sacrifice that is there, the headstones that are uniform. These are very powerful places. And I first went to the Western Front when I was 17 years old. It had a tremendous effect on me. Where I work at the Canadian War Museum, we have almost everyone has been there. We have talked about this. Incredibly moving experience to walk those silent cities, as I called them in one of my books, to see the Canadians who lay there together forever, to look at their names, to look at the age. I've found 17-year-olds, I've found 16-year-olds, I've found 45-year-olds. That is Canada. That is the Canada of the early 20th century. And as I said before, they're English Canadians and French Canadians and Russian Canadians and Ukrainian Canadians and Jewish Canadians and African Canadians and Indigenous Canadians, all together, lying there, having served king and country, having fought for the ideals that they believed in. And of course, more than 20,000 of them who have no known graves, who are captured on the Vimy Memorial or the Menin Gate. But always, to me, it has been the epitaphs that have left me in tears, looking at those headstones, looking at the sayings at the bottom of the headstone that is protruding from the earth, thinking about those parents, those grandparents, those widows, those children who tried to find the words to capture what their loved one meant. And they are among the most powerful words I have ever written or read in my 48 years.
Yeah, for sure. They're very, very powerful. I remember, I think one of our first days on the tour, we went to the site near where John McCrae wrote In Flanders Fields, and there's a cemetery there, and there's a 13-year-old boy. Like, and I was 16 at the time, and I'm thinking here, like, this is how, I mean, it was all encompassing in terms of demographics. Everyone felt the urge to participate in the effort. So yeah, it's very, very striking, and the epitaphs are indeed like very, very varied. And you go to the Vimy monument and you see all the names. You don't get a sense of how many names are actually written on that monument until you go close and you see how small that font is and how encompassing the monument is, and like encompassing the names are on that monument. It's certainly very, very striking. And I think on that note of monuments, I'm going to show you a few excerpts from the film The Field of Sacrifice, which was directed by Donald Britton, and has been made available to us today by the National Film Board. It was shot in 1964, and I think I find that interesting in terms of timing because it's 20 years after the Second World War concluded. And I actually learned quite a bit from it. So for those of you who are interested, it's available online on the National Film Board's website, and it's called The Field of Sacrifice. And I learned a lot. So I'll show you just a few small clips, and Dr. Cook will get your thoughts on that a little bit in terms of what it represents, and maybe we can expand on some of the things we see in the two films. And I found it like, in my eyes, I think it was both informative and commemorative, which is interesting. So I'm just going to stop my screen sharing for a moment to get those films up, those excerpts, and bear with me, everyone, as technology is challenging. So I've got this one here.
As we pause here, I'm enjoying reading these comments, which I've done a few of these Zoom talks.
Okay, are we good? You can see the screen, and I'm just gonna play it now. It's a pretty short clip. It's about 15 seconds long, so.
Sheep can graze on battlefields. Money can be made from battlefields. men can be remembered by battlefields.
So it's a pretty short clip, but we see the sheep there, and then we see a small glimpse of the Beaumont Hamel monument.
Yeah, that's a Donald Britton film. It's a tremendous film, and if you have an opportunity, do go to the NFB site and take a look at it. I've always found it a very moving film, for the footage, for the scenes that were selected, and those obviously left on the cutting room floor. Donald Britton also did Canada at War, which is about the only Second World War series that has been produced in this country in 1962. And I talk about it in my new book, The Fight for History, and how it was a significant offering, but sadly, one of the very few ones that we have in this country. And certainly we did for the Second World War. And as you said, Prasanna, it's an interesting time period in 1964, where for about 15 to 20 years, the First World War had been largely forgotten. The Second World War, that absolutely necessary war, had been fought. And then as the world moved beyond 1945, it moved into a new period of prosperity, certainly in the Western world. And we left behind the Great War, and it wasn't really rediscovered again until the 1960s. But in Canada, there has always been a bit of a different message. And in the early 1960s and mid-60s, we see the message of the First World War being the birth of the nation. That's where we get, in fact, the phrase, Vimy being the birth of the nation, which is, as I describe in my book on Vimy, which came from Lester B. Pearson and others. And it has been a powerful, resonating message, I think, about the transformative effects of the Great War on Canada.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And I think, it's interesting. I think it's very interesting to look at it, 20 years after the Second World War. And the two comments he's making is that sheep can graze on battlefield. And you mentioned you had a story earlier, prior to the session, Dr. Cook mentioned he had a story about sheep. So I'm very excited for that. And
well, my sheep story is this, that as some of you will know, I was the First World War historian at the Canadian War Museum, and I was involved in setting up the permanent galleries. And we did this, a small team, from 2002 to 2005 when the museum opened in May 2005. And I'm very proud of that experience. If you're interested in knowing why I write my history books the way I do, and my desire to share these stories with Canadians, because I'm a public historian. It's my work at the War Museum. It's my interactions with Canadians on a daily basis. It's my amazing colleagues who offer me great ways to think about how we can share our history with all Canadians. And I think the War Museum is a stunningly important cultural center for Canada to know its military history. But my sheep story is when we were designing the galleries, people would occasionally get a hold of my email and call me. And I had a woman who called me and said, Dr. Cook, what do you think of when you think of Vimy? And I said, well, I think of the memorial, and I think of the Canadians who are there, those 11,285. And she said, well, what else? I said, well, I think of the ridge. I think of the craters you still see to this day. And she said, yes, what else? And I had a few more observations. And she said, what else? I said, well, I don't know. What do you think of Vimy? And she said, I think of the sheep. I think of the sheep of Vimy. And it's true, because the sheep are there. And those of you who have walked Vimy, you know they're there. They're in the red zone, the danger zone. And she had a very good suggestion, which a very interesting suggestion of putting sheep on top of the Canadian War Museum to act like they do at Vimy to cut the grass. And I think it was an interesting observation of the power of Vimy, the power of the monument and the battle and the landscape, or the warscape, as I have called it. And now the museum and the memorial there, and the ways that Vimy has resonated through our history, in history books, the Vimy Foundation. It's on our $20 bill. It's in our passport. It's an important icon, symbol, and as I have said, a legend that is ours. This is our story, and it's one that helps to distinguish us and the things we did together in a very hard way more than 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I think you know, on the note of the sheep, and like, you know, it's a very, very striking visual. You get to a monument. It's very somber. It's, you know, it's a, you know, a Canadian war site. Like it's not, I mean, and then you get there and then you just see all these sheep out there grazing. And I remember during the Vimy tour that, during the Vimy Prize, one of the things that really struck out to me, and I think maybe this is a bit of a difference in terms of commemoration in Canada versus, you know, in Europe where the battles were actually fought, is that they still have undetonated shells. They have a 30-year backlog of undetonated shells that they're trying to detonate in a safe manner. And, you know, these just keep showing up, like, because how high the water table was in a lot of these areas where they were dropping, you know, shells. And these are mostly from the First World War rather than the Second World War. And again, I guess it's partially due to the precision, or rather how likely a shell that you dropped was actually to detonate.
I think those shells are incredible. And those of you watching, if you've walked the battlefields, you see the shells and you can almost put your hand in the dirt and pull up shrapnel balls and shell fragments. And some of these battlefields, the key, you know, cockpits of battle around Ypres, on the Somme, at Verdun, in the Arras area, where the major battles were fought back and forth, not just for months, but for years, were saturated with thousands upon thousands of shells per square meter. And it is quite astonishing to be driving down the laneways, and you often are on farmers' fields, if you seek to visit a small cemetery or a site that was important to the Canadian Corps or another fighting formation, and you see these unexploded ordnance at the end of the driveway, almost like garbage that's been left out for the démineurs to come by and to collect. And it's a sober reminder, I think, of the legacy of war. And I have sometimes talked about this as in another way, as a metaphor of war. This war that continues to have a hold on our imagination. It's a war that continues to haunt us. And these shells that continue to work their way to the surface year after year after year are like the memories of the war that continue to work their way forward through our national museums, through our history books, through our amazing high school teachers who teach their children, their students, through parents, through our family history. And I imagine many of the people who are on this call have a genealogical link to someone who served in the two world wars. And I wish I was with you now, because this is something I love to hear. I love to hear these family stories. I love to hear these personal stories. And I think they remind us that of the 620,000 who may have served in the First World War and the 1.1 million who served in the Second World War, putting aside the 110,000 who were killed, and that in itself is a staggering number. But putting aside them, there are millions and millions of Canadians in our country who have this strong link to the past, this shared history. And when people ask me at times, will we forget our history? Will we lose our history? One of the things I have explored in my books on Vimy and my new one, The Fight for History, there are times when we have lost our history, when we have turned our back on our military history, when we have neglected to tell our story. But I have often found that it is the children and now the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of these so many Canadians who served who help keep the flame alive.
Yeah, I think that's a very poignant answer. And I think it ties down to one of the questions that I had, because when I was preparing for the event, one of the things that kind of seems thematic, and I think your new book must be covering that to a great degree. Like, we talked about like that cyclical nature of remembrance. In your experience, what has explained it in the past? And do you have any thoughts on like what contributes to that? You know, why is it cyclical? Why, and is it just fatigue from hearing about it too much, or like what factors contribute there?
Well, it is cyclical, and I think our participants today, if you are over the age of 45 or 50, you'll remember Remembrance Day in the 60s and 70s and 80s when it was very poorly attended at the national level and in communities. And my new book, The Fight for History, I wanted to know why that was. I wanted to know why and how we remembered the Second World War. it has gone through cycles, and I talk about the many ways that we make memory and meaning out of war. We build memorials, and if we think of the thousands of memorials to the Great War, we didn't do the same in the Second World War. And I tried to explore that. Why didn't we build a national memorial in Ottawa? Why did it take until 2003 to unveil and to create the Juno Beach Center? Why had we done such a poor job in telling our history while the Americans and the British and the French and the Germans and everyone else were talking about the Second World War, and in fact using it in a way to shape the very nature and contours of memory and identity in their country? And you can think of the Americans really playing for keeps here in the field of culture. Think of The Longest Day and Saving Private Ryan, where it's their story. Think of the way that Russia uses the Great Patriotic War. Think of the way that the British talk about standing alone when, despite having 500 million supporting members in the dominions and the colonies, including India. Think about the ways that countries talk about war, in our case, Canada and Vimy. But I was wondering why we didn't do that for the Second World War for so long. And when we did, we often focused on defeat and disgrace and the strange way that Dieppe has had a held on our imagination, in a way that 6 years in the Battle of the Atlantic and the incredible contributions of Canadians fighting in Normandy or Italy or clearing the Scheldt, perhaps the most important land campaign during the Second World War, fought almost entirely by Canadians, why those don't resonate. And so you're exactly right. We have gone through cycles of remembrance, of commemoration, of telling our stories. And the low point was really the early 1990s, I think, with the Valor and the Horror film. And then it changed. And I think the key event was the 50th anniversary and the return of thousands of veterans overseas, our aged warriors, many in their mid-70s at that point, welcomed back as liberators. Right. I've been very lucky to speak to veterans my whole life, and I heard their stories, and I've asked them the questions. And to me, this is one of my favorite things about my job at the War Museum, to meet veterans, to talk to them, not just of the Second World War and the Great War, where I'm old enough to have been able to talk to many of them, but our modern peacekeepers and members of the Canadian forces and those who served in Afghanistan and all the difficult missions and campaigns and wars after 45.
Right.
And I think there is a cyclical nature, and it's one that bears reflecting upon. I think if there is good news, I think we are paying more attention to our shared past, our history, and what our Canadian Forces members have done and what they continue to do, and how veterans have helped to build up this country.
And in that, I think one of my questions, and I'm not asking you to necessarily, give away all the secrets in your book, but does Canada's reputation as a peacekeeping country kind of make Canada in the 50s onwards kind of shy about talking about the military history, or you think it's very distinct? I know, for example, that Lester Pearson was a key member or key contributor to founding of the United Nations and all of these things that happen, right? So how much does that play a role in?
It does. I'm very proud of our peacekeeping history. I think we all should be. We have been a force for good around the world. And Pearson and the Suez Crisis, where he was able to intervene with the support of Norway, United States, and other nations, but actually suggest and have committed a peacekeeping force, should be recognized in this country, as it was with Pearson himself with the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957. But the peacekeeping symbol has been a comfortable one for Canadians, and comfortable insofar as we haven't had to think about war and conflict. And I think of the 20th century, where we fought at least 6 wars: the South African War, the Great War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Cold War, the Gulf War in 1990-91, the Kosovo bombing campaign, and of course our Afghanistan war, I think that's the right phrase as opposed to mission, for more than 10 years. Think of the 19th century, how our country was shaped by war and conflict. Think of the 18th century, where our very destiny has been shaped. And think before that of indigenous warfare. So it's a part of our history, and we do a disservice to our past, if you care about these things, as I do, to pretend we're something that we're not. And that isn't to suggest that we need only to talk about war. That would be absurd as well. And yet we should not forget our shared past. And one of the things we do at the War Museum is, this is our mission and mandate. These are the stories that we tell. the way that war has shaped Canada. And I'm very lucky to be the curator of a new exhibition at the War Museum that'll open in November called Forever Change, Stories of the Second World War. And it really explores the impact of the Second World War on Canadians, those fighting around the world, those contributing to the war effort at home, men and women, English Canadians, French Canadians, New Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, Canadians from all classes. It'll be a powerful exhibition, and I hope you can join us at the War Museum, which has reopened again since early September, to hear these stories and to better understand our shared history.
That sounds very interesting for sure. And yes, hopefully we can all travel and go and visit the exhibition. So just before we get into the question period, I'm just going to show one other short clip from the same film, Field to Sacrifice. And then I'm looking at some of the questions, and they're all, like, some of them are very interesting. Maybe I'll get you to answer one while I get that up and running. Roberta asks, or says, thank you for this interesting talk. And is it possible to say a few words about the Department of Militia and Defence's initial official history program designed to codify the Canadian war effort? And she's quoting from your book, The Battle and the Legend, page 234, very, very precise.
Oh, there you go. Well, thanks, Roberta. It sounds almost like a planted question, because I did my doctoral thesis on the writing of Canadian military history. And so that's a book called Cleo's Warriors from 2006 that gives full details into the writing of our military history. And that has always fascinated me. Before I was a curator and historian at the War Museum, I was an archivist at the National Archives. So I'm interested in archives and memory. I'm interested in the ways that we tell our stories and how we codify our history. That's a nice word that you use there. So that's a book I suppose I would point you to. But in a very brief manner, we had a historian, Colonel A.F. Dogood, who was tasked with writing the history of Canada's Great War effort in 8 volumes. It was a very ambitious task. He was not able to succeed, as many of you know. Only a single volume emerged in 1938, and that only up to the midpoint of 1915. And as I have argued in Vimy and other books, the failure to have an official history is simply one more example of how we did not tell our story. And certainly with the Great War, veterans, and I recount this in Cleo's Warriors, were furious that there was no official history, because the Canadian Corps and the Canadian Expeditionary Force had punched so hard and so high above their weight. And yet the Americans claimed to have won that war. And in the late 1920s and early 1930s, there was a furious debate in Canada over the failure to write our history. So I encourage you to take a look at that book if my commentary has whetted your appetite a bit.
Thank you very much for the answer, Dr. Cook. I'm going to start the second clip now. I think it should work. And then there are great questions coming in. So if you have any questions for those of you participating, by all means, ask them in the Q&A section of the application. I'm sharing my screen, and I think we should be good to go. Let's watch this clip. It's about the Vimy Memorial itself.
Where men first felt poison gas.
So I misspoke. It's the Passchendaele Memorial, but I think you know, it's interesting because in the 60s there's still someone dutifully grooming the trees, and it's very, very well manicured. And I guess very briefly, if you wanted to just comment on
that's the Brooding Soldier. Near Passchendaele, but not there. That's at the Battle of Saint-Julien, or the Second Battle of Ypres, as it's often called. And of course, that is the battle, the first really trial by fire battle by the Canadians in April of 1915, where the Germans unleashed chlorine gas on the 22nd of April, and where the Canadian division fought in a really significant rearguard battle over 4 bloody days. And the Canadians made their reputation there. And those of you who have been to the War Museum know the massive Richard Jack painting that is in Gallery 2, the First World War Gallery. It captures, I think, the epic nature of that battle. That's the battlefield where John McCrae rode in Flanders Fields. And when there was the competition in 1919 and 1920 to create a number of overseas memorials, of which Walter Allward's design for Vimy became first, and that became the place to market, Clemshaw's brooding soldier, as we call that very powerful monument, was the second choice, and it was erected there and unveiled much earlier in 1923. And to me, I have been there. I imagine many participants have. It's a striking memorial, very rare. There's very few others like it. And I have always found it somber, evocative, and a dark place as well. And I think when we talk about memorials, we need to remember that they are often on sites of tremendous violence and grief and loss, that they stand as markers to those things, but also, in this case in particular, the incredible stand and fighting defense of the Canadians who faced not one but two gas attacks, one on the 22nd, the other on the 24th of April. And so it's a place, like so many of these memorials, with mixed emotions, but one that if you ever have a chance to go to the Western Front, you simply must go there, along with Vimy and Beaumont-Hamel, and to the Somme.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and people are very, active in the chat. I appreciate that. They were very quick to correct me as well. So it's good to have a very engaged audience. And yeah, it is very somber. And I guess my one question there, and maybe like, I guess when we went to, during the Vimy Prize, the annual ceremony for the Dieppe Raid, just in general, how the war memorials are treated, I guess, or like just far more visited, far more frequented. I mean, part of that can be just explained by population and, just having those visual reminders in your day-to-day by undetonated shells and so on. But is it also, is there a cultural element there historically in terms of the commemoration of the First World War? And we've kind of touched on this topic a few times during this talk, but is there anything you'd like to add there?
So between the commemoration of
Canada,
the First World War and
yeah.
the Second World War?
No, rather, sorry, between Canada and Europe in terms of the commemoration of just even Canadian involvement, right? For example, anniversary of the Dieppe Raid and other, that's the Second World War, of course, but, I don't want to call it celebrated, but I think it's just the nature of the commemorated events are different. And these are...
They are different because they span different decades and different wars. And I think the way we build memorials is often shaped by our current society. And I think if we think of the aftermath of the Great War and the search for meaning and to create a usable memory of that war, we turned very much to our memorials. We didn't do the same in the Second World War. Very much we focused on the veterans. If one thinks of the Veterans Charter as an incredible series of programs to propel the country forward, of which I would argue that was maybe the greatest contribution. But as a result of that, as a result of not building the same Second World War memorials, and I've been to Dieppe, I have stood there, it's a very powerful place. And yet for decades, there was nothing there to mark that the Canadians had ever fought there. And the same, and even more egregiously in my mind, at Juno Beach, where we simply did not mark what we did. And I think it was a tremendous failure of foresight and knowledge by our government of various days not to build a memorial there to tell the world what we had done. Because Vimy is one of the most visited sites on the Western Front. When I wrote my book a couple of years ago, 750,000 visitors a year. It's more now. And they come to hear the Canadian story. We did not do that for D-Day. Mm-hmm. And I think that by not doing that, we failed to tell our story. And I would argue today in the 21st century, we're living in a very contentious period where history is divisive, where history can be scary, where history can be weaponized. And again, this is a period where we should be brave and we should face the past. And I'm not ever calling for heroic chest-thumping history, but nor do I want to diminish what we have done together in times of great strain and struggle. And so I think that we must continue to face our shared history, because it grounds who we are. It tells us about who we are in the contemporary Canada, and maybe where we might be going forward. Why don't we listen to, why don't you read me a couple questions?
Yeah, so I just got that. I think I was having some issues with the app, but now I see Kelly asks, Dr. Cook, do you feel that the social wrestling and upheaval that is in the news as of late regarding who and how and what we want to remember of history and how history should be memorialized, including both wars of the 20th century, is important and perhaps necessary? Do you see it as a step in that cyclical process of remembrance that you've just spoken of?
I do, Kelly, and thanks. It's a great question and a great observation. Our history is always contested. There's always a struggle. That's why I called my new book, The Fight for History. There are champions. There are interest groups. And that shouldn't surprise us if you have any understanding of how society works. And yet history has been weaponized. History at times has been used to further an agenda. There can be no denying of that either. So to answer your question, I think it's part of the process, and I have seen it in the past in my books on Vimy and the new one, and I think it's a part of the nature. What I see now perhaps is more intolerance to other views and opinions, and I find that disturbing. And that's not just in this realm; it's in all realms. That's my personal opinion. I think we're going through a period of questioning our past, which I think is always good. But as I said before, I don't think we should be afraid of that, and I think we must confront it head on. It is sometimes too easy to condemn those in the past for not thinking the way we think today. The very least, we have all lived through the rights revolution of the 1980s and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We see groups differently now, and to apply today's standards to the past may be fine in one realm, but to hold them accountable to the present is simply ahistorical. And if you are doing that, you're not doing history, you're doing activist history. And so I think that's something to reflect upon as individuals. My final thought on this, and one of the things I write in The Fight for History, is the need to be vigilant, the need to fight for history. We have always had champions, and it's not an easy thing. I mean, we live in a world of massive, where history is not a prominent aspect to our everyday lives. And it takes work and it takes effort to think about the past and what it means to us today. And if we don't do that, as I have noted, we run the very real risk of losing our past, losing what is important to us and unique to us. And in this globalized world that we live in, there isn't much anymore that's just Canadian, but our history is. That isn't to say it hasn't been affected by other countries, as it surely has, and yet this is our story. And if we don't tell it, no one else will.
The next question we have is very, very similar. It ties in very nicely. Jean-Pierre makes this observation. Walking the battlefields, towns, and fields in northern France, I am consumed by scars and marks of the two world wars here. Remembrance, much like at home in Canada, isn't always on the minds of younger generations here in France, even though they see the evidence and hear the stories. How do we engage better as Canadians, those who might never have the chance to walk up to the Vimy Memorial or the Caribou at Beaumont-Hamel, and how do we engage them to also recognize the contribution of modern day veterans? Because remembrance doesn't just include those who fought the world wars.
I think it's important, clearly, to pass on our stories to the next generation. It's important to build the structures so that they can know, be it a war museum or a memorial or a film or a documentary. It's important for us to make history relevant as well. And I have often written about underage soldiers in the Great War. And I've spoken to schools in Ottawa and in fact across the country as one way to explain. I think, Prasanna, as you said, when you were 16 or 17, to walk that battlefield and to understand that people their age, that would be grade 11 or 12, I imagine, served overseas and fought and died. That's one way. I have often been asked around Remembrance Day, oh, Dr. Cook, isn't it terrible that our kids don't know anything? And I've begun to push back against that because my three daughters, Chloe, Emma, and Paige, know quite a lot about the World Wars and Canadian history. Now, to be fair, behind me, you can see a lot of books, and there are about 3,000 others in our house. My wife, Sarah, is an archivist, and history is important to us. I think it's important to many families. I think young people learn a tremendous about the Great War. I think of Remembrance Day ceremonies in all the schools my kids have been in. They have been involved there. So there has been a significant push in recent years, and I think we need to continue to encourage that and to do our best. And frankly, you 59 participants who are taking the time out of your lunch to listen to this, you clearly care about this as well. So I would offer it back to you to think about how it matters to you, how we might tell these stories. And maybe I'll flip it back to you, Prasanna, because I want this to be a conversation. How did you get interested in this?
So I think you're right in terms of, schools being a big part of it. I think I could not credit my, education like that, the New Brunswick education I got enough for this because, so one of the interesting things is that Remembrance Day is not a statutory holiday across the country. And I remember being very shocked when, I went to Montreal and, and then found out that people go to work on Remembrance Day. And even though it was a day off here, they would make a big effort to put in a ceremony. Every year we'd have a ceremony. We had veterans from the Legion come every year. And I think it's, that human touch, that human interaction that we got. And maybe I can't, of course, speak for experiences across the country, though, my peers on the Vimy Prize had a similar experience. And so I think that human touch, of course, is, hard, unfortunately, most of our veterans have now, passed.
It looks like we've lost Prasanna there.
It's a matter of finding different ways to engage. And
you're back.
Okay, good. That's unfortunate. But I think, yeah, it's a matter of finding new ways to engage. And I think some of the projects that the Vimy Foundation has done, like colorizing First World War images and having seminars like this where we can talk to people, in a little bit more casual manner. And I think you were talking about your books and how you want to make history accessible. And I think, I read Shock Troops when I was 16, and you told a story that was easy enough for me to digest. It's a very big volume. It's intimidating when you're a 16-year-old. You're like, oh, I'm supposed to read this? And, and it was very, very accessible. And I think that's a big key part of it, is just making history accessible to others.
Yeah. Prasanna, how about we ask the group here? Maybe you can write in a comment if you think of an interesting way to tell our history. There's the Lest We Forget program that has been around for years by Blake. This involves researching the names on cenotaphs and going to the library archives and looking at the names and making those personal connections. At the War Museum, where I'm lucky to work, as you know, we have a supply line kit that goes out into schools containing history and material culture, and this is wildly popular. But I open it up to you. I don't have all the answers, and I imagine some of you might.
So there are a couple interesting comments on that already. Annette said that she got interested into the First World War or the war because her grandmother was a First World War bride. I have also researched men on my local cenotaph, says Annette. So that's very interesting. René asked an interesting question tied to this. Bonjour, Dr. Cook. In a more digital world, with a hyper-connected youth population, do we still need physical places for remembrance? And that's a very interesting and poignant question today because, we're doing this virtually entirely.
I think you do. I think you need to have places to gather, to come together, to hear stories. I think of the amazing programs of our veterans who go into schools and classrooms. I think of places like the War Museum and the Juno Beach Center. I think of our local memorials. I think of the churches across this country with stained glass windows. I think of the business stores that are 100 years old. that have plaques and memorials, I think you have to do that. But I also believe, and I think this is maybe where you're leading, that we need to think about digital means to communicate our stories. And I would love young people to come forward and say, you know what, I'm never going to read one of your 600-page books, Cook, but I would love for you to do a whole series of tweets. Now, I'm not the guy to do that, but there may be others who are. And I think we need to think about this. And luckily, I think there are people thinking about this. I'm always amazed. I sit as a director with Canada's History Society. The dedicated teachers that we recognize through that society is always astonishing to me. The programs that they do, not just in military history, but investigating the past in their communities with Indigenous history, all manner of questions of voices that have been silenced. We need to continue to do this at all levels. And I think the fight for history at one level is a fight against apathy. It is a fight against those who say it doesn't matter. And I tell you now, it does matter.
So we have a couple of more minutes left. So for those of you who are being a little bit shy about sharing your questions, this is the time, just to let you guys know. And I'm going to just tie in a few other comments here. They're very interesting. So a couple of people said, both Simon and Clint have talked about like making it personal. So Clint said, identifying examples of individual soldiers' experiences and making it personal is one way to commemorate. Simon Paget says, there's nothing like walking in their footsteps in battlefields and cemeteries. And I think I agree in terms of that virtual. Yeah, like virtual is great. And, you know, it has a very, very useful tool. So I had an earlier question from Ted who was asking, are there any public resources available where I can gather information on my great-grandfather's service history from World War I? So my initial gut feeling is, of course, Library and Archives Canada is, you know, has a lot of First World War reference materials.
Yeah, there's a personnel file for every Canadian who served in the First World War at the Library Archives Canada. If you search, I imagine your descendant will be listed there. If you look under First World War attestation papers, and perhaps the Vimy Foundation could put a link up to that or send out a follow-on message. It's an amazing place to understand the history of an individual. You'll want to read letters. If you look at the Canadian Letters and Images Project, an incredible website of thousands and thousands of Canadian soldiers' letters from the two world wars and other conflicts before and after. I suggest you come to the Canadian War Museum. I was the curator for an online exhibition called Canada in the First World War. It has about 1,000 artifacts, images, works of art, 100,000 words of text. It's bilingual. That's an important resource. I encourage you to read books and to delve into, but there's a step-by-step process, and it tends to involve first the attestation paper. So good luck with that. And I think you will find there are other groups out there. There's a Western Front Association where there are 2 meetings in Canada, or 2 groups in Canada, and an enormous organization over in Britain and around the world. And I think there's nothing more powerful than to explore our own personal history and our own family history. So good luck.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. A couple more observations. Pam mentioned that there's the Canadian website. So that's another great spot if you are looking for names. That's also there. Very, very relevant. Thank you, Pam. And just a few other observations about remembrance and, like, I guess from our modern theme that we were discussing, or like modern day remembrance. Scott said that his interest was piqued by reading of a diary of a relative who served in the First World War. It made it very personal and human. I entirely agree. One of the reading materials we had to read was the letters of Agar Adamson for my Vimy Prize. And, you know, it's letters that he's written. And I think, you know, in the modern day, I guess you're going to have to read through text, and it would be a very, very different way of structuring and telling a story, but it does make it personal. And on the same note of making it personal, Steve said, veterans are not just old people. A number of years ago, I had a long conversation with a still serving soldier in Afghanistan whose view was totally different to mine at the age of 62 at the time. And yes, I entirely agree. You can definitely talk to modern veterans. And we did have a lot of that during our Remembrance Day ceremonies. And I probably should have acknowledged that as well. And of course, to make it even more personal, it was often, you know, a parent, as a classmate. So, you know, you knew the person and they're a real human to you. I have a very good question about the new exhibit that you were mentioning earlier at the Canadian War Museum. Kayla asks, how will it explore Indigenous engagement with the military? Will it touch on the mistreatment and forced enfranchisement of Indigenous veterans? Or what about the link to the cadet programs in residential schools and the number of students who enlisted? So that's a very interesting question there.
It is a great question. Thank you. And maybe we'll use this as the last question. The Forever Changed exhibition will open in November, and it really focuses on the stories of Canadians. And as I've mentioned several times, of English Canadians and French and New Canadians and Indigenous. And we have very powerful stories. I think of Mary Grey Eyes, who will be discussed in the exhibition. I think about a Métis sailor by the name of Boyer, who is a part of our exhibition. We have their material culture. This is a really interesting exhibition, I think, because we use the material culture and their stories and we interweave them together to tell larger, more encompassing stories while also drilling down into the personal. And for me, and I think many here, the story of individuals is what moves us. Often this is how we find our connections. This is how we make meaning and understanding of the past. And this is something we wanted to do at the War Museum. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out, of course, we're in the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Victory in May of 45 and then against Japan in August of 1945. And at the Canadian War Museum, we wanted to mark that. We were aware that the 50th anniversary was a key event in our history, in the way that we recognized not just veterans of the Second World War, but all veterans. And this year, the 75th, while of course COVID has led to all kinds of cancellations and delays, our museum is now open, and we look forward to people coming back and to understanding their shared history. And I think to remember, as a final thought, that this year, the 75th anniversary, now where we had 1.1 million Canadians who served in the Second World War, we are down to fewer than 30,000. And now is an important time to reflect upon that and the fact that our veterans will be gone in 5 to 10 years. And what will that mean for us? Those who are still here, those who believe in the importance of telling their stories. What will we do now in the remaining time that we have, and what will we do after our last veteran has passed away? That is on all of us. And I think that will be a struggle that we must all come to grips with.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very, very good note to, conclude the session on. I think, we've all made it, it's been very clear thematically, both through the questions and the answers, that, making it personal, but also remembering long-term is very important to everyone who has attended. And on that note, Dr. Cook, thank you so much for being available. It's been a great pleasure to be able to ask you these questions, poke your brain. Thank you so much to all the participants, because I've been very touched at how thoughtful all of the questions and answers and the comments in the chat have been. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I think just the kind of the range of questions that were asked and just the type of questions was great. I thank everyone for coming and taking time out of their lunch hour to attend virtually. And thanks once again to our partners at the Vimy Foundation, the Canadian War Museum, and the National Film Board, and of course the funding provided by Veterans and Affairs Canada. So thank you very much, Dr. Cook, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.